The life of Lama Thubten Yeshe, born in 1935 and passed in 1984, is divided into two nearly equal sections, with 1959 marking the halfway point. Lama Yeshe spent the first 24 years in Tibet, fully immersed in the Buddhist culture of that technologically undeveloped but spiritually advanced civilization on the roof of the world. That part of his life came to a sudden and violent end when the communist Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet sent His Holiness the Dalai Lama and tens of thousands of his countrymen and women into exile. As Lama Yeshe himself later remarked, in 1959, the Chinese kindly told us it was time to leave Tibet and meet the outside world. The remaining 25 years of his life were spent first as a refugee in India and Nepal, and then as a tireless traveler throughout much of this outside world. Together with his heart son and spiritual heir, Lama Thubten Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Yeshe was in the forefront of those masters who brought the Buddhist teachings that had been preserved in Tibet for centuries to the technologically advanced but spiritually thirsty West. To gain a deeper appreciation of the contributions that Lama Yeshe and the others exiled Tibetan Buddhist masters made, it will be helpful to know something about the Buddhist teachings they carried out of Tibet with them, and the value these teachings had for the Westerners they met. The Life and Teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. These teachings can be traced back over 25 centuries to the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, from 563 to 483 before the Common Era. Born just north of what is now the border between India and Nepal, he was the son of the ruler of the local Shakya clan and was given the personal name Siddhartha. He grew up surrounded by the luxuries of the royal life, a virtual prisoner in the pleasure palace his father had built for him to keep him isolated from the harsh realities of the world. But when he was 29 years old, he suddenly became acutely aware of old age, sickness, and death, and all their attendant miseries. Moved by compassion for all beings condemned to experience such suffering over and over again, he left the life of luxury behind and became a homeless wanderer, seeking liberation from all states of unsatisfactory existence. His spiritual quest began by training under two renowned gurus who taught their followers how to enter profound states of meditative concentration. Although he soon mastered everything these gurus taught him, Siddhartha discovered that these powerful trance-like states of meditative absorption could offer only a temporary respite from suffering. They were unable to confer the lasting freedom he was intent on discovering. So he decided to go into the forest and engage in the practice of strictest asceticism, aiming to break through to complete and lasting liberation from suffering through the force of sheer willpower. For 6 years, accompanied by other ascetics known as the Group of Five, Siddhartha engaged in increasingly severe forms of self-denial, fasting so relentingly, that's a hard word, fasting so unrelentingly that his once glorious body was reduced to little more than a living skeleton. After 6 years of uninterrupted asceticism, and in a greatly weakened state as a result, he realized that he was no closer to his goal than when he had started, reasoning that he could only be successful in his spiritual quest if he followed a middle path, avoiding the extremes of both self-indulgence and self-mortification. He broke his fast by accepting a bowl of milk rice offered to him by Sujata, the wife of a local herdsman. His 5 companions took this as a sign that Siddhartha had abandoned his spiritual quest, and in disgust, they left to continue their ascetic practices without him. But strengthened by the nourishing meal he had just received, Siddhartha now felt confident that he could achieve the liberation for which he had been so arduously striving. He crossed a nearby river and took his seat under what would later become known as the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment, vowing not to arise until he had attained his goal. That night, after subduing the mental disturbances that interfere with deep meditation, Siddhartha engaged in a penetrating investigation of the nature of his own mind. As this investigation deepened, he became aware of a pattern that pervaded the lives of all beings, including himself. He saw that harmful actions committed in one life lead inevitably to suffering in subsequent lives. He further saw that all such harmful actions are motivated by the delusions of greed, hatred, jealousy, arrogance, and the like, and that these in turn arise from a fundamental misunderstanding of the way things actually exist. Chief among these ignorant misconceptions is the view of oneself as a separate, self-existent entity, independent of everything else. He saw how, in a vain attempt to defend and promote this ignorantly conceived self-identity, we condemn ourselves to unending suffering and dissatisfaction. Siddhartha saw all of this directly with his penetrating wisdom. Cutting through even the subtlest form of misconception, he rid himself of their destructive influence entirely, thereby achieving lasting freedom from suffering and its cause. With this attainment of spiritual liberation, or nirvana, he became an arhat, or foe destroyer, having vanquished the true inner enemies responsible for the cycle of recurring misery known as samsara. And because his penetrating, insightful wisdom was empowered by countless lifetimes of compassionate activity on behalf of others, he not only gained personal liberation from samsaric suffering, but the unsurpassably blissful state of full spiritual awakening, or bodhi, as well. He was now no longer simply Siddhartha, but had become Shakyamuni Buddha, the fully awakened sage of the Shakya clan. He was 35 years old, and during the remaining 45 years of his life, he employed the limitless wisdom, compassion, and skill that comes with Buddhahood to lead others along their path to liberation and full enlightenment. Realizing that his 5 former companions were ripe to benefit from the spiritual realizations, or dharma, he had gained, he journeyed to the deer park in Sarnath, on the outskirts of the ancient holy city of Varanasi, where they had gone to pursue their ascetic practices. And so it was there in Sarnath that Shakyamuni Buddha first turned the wheel of Dharma, revealing to the group of 5 what have become popularly known as the Four Noble Truths. These 4, the basis of all his subsequent Dharma teachings, are the truths of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the Eightfold Path leading to this cessation, a path consisting of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. First one, and then all 5 of those who heard his first Dharma discourse, or sutra, soon attained penetrating insight into these 4 truths. Achieving liberation from suffering, they too became arhats. These 5 arhats thus became the first members of the Buddha's spiritual community, or Sangha. In this way, the 3 jewels of refuge to which all Buddhists turn for guidance and inspiration came into being, namely, the Buddha as teacher, the Dharma as the teachings, and the Sangha as those putting those teachings into practice. During the early years of the Sangha's existence, the community of the Buddha's disciples grew rapidly, eventually numbering in the tens of thousands, including laymen and women, as well as ordained monks and nuns. More and more people, impressed by the example of the compassionate Buddha and by the peace that radiated from his disciples, took sincere interest in following the Buddha's Eightfold Path. After he gave his last teaching, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, work out your salvation with diligence, and then passed away, his enlightening insights were transmitted from guru to disciple in unbroken lineages, and this has continued for the most part up to the present day. Buddhist practice in India. The disciples who devoted themselves to cultivating the Dharma realizations that the Buddha's teachings were meant to bring about can be divided, broadly speaking, into 2 groups, differentiated by the motivation they had for engaging in spiritual training. Lama Yeshe generally referred to those whose primary motivation was to achieve their own personal liberation from suffering as followers of the Hinayana, or lesser vehicle. The practices they followed to achieve this personal liberation centered on the 3 trainings that incorporate the entire Eightfold Path, namely ethical discipline, concentration, and wisdom. Sincere practitioners who trained themselves well in this way were able, like the original group of 5, to attain nirvana, the state beyond sorrow, and thereby became arhats, having completely conquered the delusions of hatred, attachment, ignorance, jealousy, and the like, ultimately responsible for all suffering. The members of the second group of disciples were not nearly as numerous as the first. They were known as bodhisattvas, or enlightenment-bound beings, and their intention was to achieve something beyond their own personal liberation from suffering and dissatisfaction. Possessing the great compassion that regards others' suffering as unbearable as if it were their own, these supremely dedicated practitioners were willing to spend however long it might take, even countless lifetimes, to achieve the same complete awakening that Shakyamuni Buddha himself had achieved under the Bodhi tree, so that, like him, they too could offer limitless assistance to others. The practice of these courageous disciples consisted primarily of the 6 perfections: giving, ethical discipline, patience, perseverance, concentration, and wisdom, all of which were motivated by bodhicitta, the altruistic resolve to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of benefiting others. Practitioners motivated by such an altruistic resolve were referred to as followers of the Mahayana, or greater vehicle. Thus, in accordance with the different dispositions and aptitudes of those devoting themselves to the Dharma, there arose 2 interrelated styles of Buddhist practice. During Buddha's lifetime, and for at least 4 centuries thereafter, the practices aimed at achieving individual liberation were widely disseminated, while those aimed at achieving nothing less than the full enlightenment of Buddhahood were passed on only to those supremely compassionate disciples who had the selfless dedication needed to follow them. Eventually, however, through the efforts of such great Indian masters as Nagarjuna in the 2nd century and Asanga in the 4th, the way of the compassionate bodhisattvas became well known and widespread. From among the many different schools of Buddhism that arose in the 1st centuries after the passing of Shakyamuni Buddha, one in particular, the Theravadan, or way of the elders, became predominant, and it was Theravada Buddhism that eventually spread from India in a southerly direction and took root in the lands now known as Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, Thailand, Myanmar, formerly Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and other parts of Southeast Asia. In contrast, the traditions associated with Mahayana Buddhism spread in a northerly direction to such countries as China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, and Tibet. Mahayana Buddhism in Tibet. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often refers to the teachings practiced in Tibet as the Buddhism of the Nalanda tradition. For many hundreds of years, from roughly the 5th century until it was destroyed by invaders at the end of the 12th century, the North Indian monastery of Nalanda was one of the most important centers of learning in the world, supported by both Hindu and Buddhist rulers and attracting students from as far away as Tibet and China to the east, and Persia and Greece to the west. It was at Nalanda and the other monasteries associated with it that the various strands of the Mahayana tradition underwent their fullest development in India. Fortunately, before the destruction of Nalanda and the virtual disappearance of Buddhism in the land of its birth, these Mahayana teachings, including those of the advanced Vajrayana, or diamond vehicle traditions, had been successfully transplanted from India to Tibet. For over 1,000 years, these precious teachings were kept alive in the land of snows, and they continued to be practiced there until the events of 1959. What is special about these Vajrayana teachings? While the more general Buddhist teachings, based on the sutras, present a gradual path to enlightenment, the more advanced Vajrayana teachings, based on esoteric discourses known as tantras, reveal a radically different approach. They present what is sometimes referred to as the resultant path to enlightenment. Such a path empowers those qualified to follow it to visualize themselves, even prior to the attainment of enlightenment, as having already attained the enlightened body, speech, and mind of a Buddha. This style of practice, called taking the future result into the present moment, enables fully qualified practitioners, such as the Mahasiddhas or greatly accomplished tantric adepts or yogis of India, to complete the path to full enlightenment within a very short space of time, in some cases, just a few years. The success of these tantric practices depends on many factors, the most essential being how well one keeps the commitments made when receiving empowerment from the fully qualified guru who initiates one into these practices. In addition, it is important that one's practice is built on the solid foundation of the general sutra path, especially the cultivation of a particularly powerful bodhicitta motivation to achieve enlightenment as swiftly as possible in order to be of maximum benefit to others. Without proper reliance on one's guru and the cultivation of a supremely altruistic motivation, the powerful methods of Tantra can be very dangerous, leading to monstrous egohood rather than enlightening Buddhahood. From among the many Mahasiddhas in India, there were several who played major roles in bringing the lineages of Vajrayana Buddhism to Tibet. The first was Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava, who in the 8th century was invited by the Tibetan king Trisung Detsen to help found Samye, the first Buddhist monastery in Tibet. Padmasambhava, regarded by Tibetans as a second Buddha, instituted what became known as the Nyingma, or ancient tradition, so called because it is the oldest of the major Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and many of its teachings are based on the earliest translations into Tibetan of the Buddhist scriptures from India. During the years 836 to 842, Buddhism in Tibet suffered a serious setback when it was violently suppressed by the anti-religious King Langdarma, who attempted to obliterate Buddhism from his realm. Langdarma's efforts were devastating, prompting a later ruler, King Changchopu, to invite the great Indian master Dipkamkara Srijnana, more widely known as Atisha, to come to Tibet to help revitalize the Buddhist lineages that had been so severely weakened during Langdarma's persecution. Atisha, born in 982, lived to 1054, spent the last 17 years of his life in Tibet, where he founded the Kadam tradition and wrote the prototype of the Stages of the Path, or Lamrim texts, that form the basis of so much subsequent Tibetan Buddhist study and practice. Although the Kadam did not survive as a separate tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, its teachings were incorporated into the 4 traditions that continue to be practiced down to the present day. The first of these 4 is the Nyingma, already mentioned. The remaining 3, referred to collectively as the Sarma or new traditions, in comparison with the older Nyingma, all had roots in Atisha's Kadam and are known individually as the Sakya, Kargyu, and Gelu traditions. Their histories are too complex and intertwined to be discussed at length here, but a few words about each might be helpful. The Sakya tradition was established by 5 great scholar practitioners known as the 3 white masters and the 2 red masters, of which the Sakya Pandita, Kunga Gyaltsen, 1181 to 1251, is perhaps the most famous. These masters have based their teachings largely on those of the Indian Mahasiddha Virupa. In addition, they also held the Sutra and Tantra teachings of many other Indian Mahasiddhas, such as Naropa. The Kargyu tradition also developed from the teachings of Naropa, as well as from those of another Indian Mahasiddha, Maitripa. The first Tibetan masters of the Kargyu tradition were Marpa the translator and his disciple Jetsun Milarepa. Milarepa, perhaps the most beloved of all the figures in Tibet's history, is especially noted for the strength of his devotion to his guru and for having achieved complete enlightenment in one lifetime on the basis of that devotion. His spontaneous songs of spiritual realization are still sung today, and his biography remains one of the most powerful sources of inspiration for Dharma practitioners. The fourth and youngest of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions is the Gelug, founded by the extraordinary scholar-yogi Losang Drakpa Je Tsongkhapa, 1357 to 1419. Along with the brilliant Sakya Pandita, Tsongkhapa is regarded as an emanation of Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, and the 18 volumes of his writings elucidate many of the most difficult points in the thought and practice of both Sutra and Tantra. Because he incorporated the entirety of Atisha's teachings into his own tradition, the Gelug is sometimes known as the Nukadam. Tsongkhapa, or Je Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa, or Je Rinpoche, as he is also called, studied with many of the greatest masters of the Buddhist traditions in his day. Prominent among them was the Sakya Lama Rendawa, and the two of them shared a reciprocal guru-disciple relationship, each teaching and learning from the other. Of his many activities on behalf of the Tibetan people and the flourishing of the Dharma in Tibet, Tsongkhapa is particularly noted for reforming and revitalizing the practice of monastic discipline. He founded Ganden Monastery, and disciples of his founded Drepung and Sera, the last name being the monastery in which Lama Yeshe resided for 18 years. These 3 great centers of Buddhist learning and practice, all located in the vicinity of Lhasa, Tibet's major city, eventually grew to house many thousands of monks. To the west of Lhasa is Tibet's second largest city, Shigatse, and it was in this area that Genten Drupa, another of Tsongkhapa's disciples, founded the 4th major Gelug monastery, Tashilhunpo, in 1447. Thus, within a very short span of time, the practice of monasticism was greatly strengthened and expanded, and the Gelug grew to become the largest of the 4 Tibetan Buddhist traditions. Any investigation into the history of these 4 traditions quickly reveals that they are anything but unrelated, opposing entities. As even the brief summary just concluded shows, many of the greatest masters of one tradition have studied with masters of the others, and practices that developed within one tradition often passed into the others. Therefore, it is important to keep in mind what the great non-sectarian master Jangyang Khenze Rinpoche has written. All of these many traditions, except for their having different names, do not in fact differ at all. In essence, they all come together on one point. Each and every one of them teaches methods for accomplishing the same ultimate goal, the full enlightenment of Buddhahood. The most prominent exponent of this non-sectarian view nowadays is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the 14th in the line that began nearly 600 years ago with Genden Drumpa, the founder of Tashi Lumpo. Although the first Dalai Lama was a disciple of the founder of the Gelug order, the 14th Dalai Lama, born in 1935, the same year as Lama Yeshe, is not exclusively associated with any one tradition. Instead, he receives and transmits teachings from all four. Furthermore, since the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, in the 1600s, the successive Dalai Lamas have been the leaders of the successive Dalai Lamas have been the leaders of the Tibetan people. Thus, an important responsibility of the present Dalai Lama is to help ensure that even in exile, all these traditions flourish and that the teaching lineages they maintain are passed on in unbroken succession for future generations. And now the final section of this introduction, the meeting of East and West. For 1,000 years, the Tibetans zealously guarded and preserved the treasure they had received from India, the entire range of the Mahayana teachings of Sutra and Tantra leading to full enlightenment. Behind the forbidding walls of the Himalayan mountains, which both protected and largely isolated them from the outside world, most of those Tibetans who wished could study and practice these teachings without interruption or interference. As a result, enough of these sincere practitioners gained enlightening realizations that the entire society was affected, producing a resilient people able to remain good-humored even while facing the challenges of eking out an existence in the harsh conditions on the roof of the world. With the communist takeover of their country in the 1950s, however, this splendid isolation came to an end. Along with it, the Tibetans lost their freedom to carry on their cultural traditions, and specifically their religious practices, undisturbed. The virtual annihilation of what had been for so long their accustomed way of life caused many of them to follow the Dalai Lama and seek freedom in exile, as already mentioned. The displaced Tibetans were not the only people who were leaving their home countries in large numbers and making their way to India, Nepal, and neighboring lands. Many Westerners also headed there in the 60s and 70s, looking for something their lives of affluence had been unable to provide them. Disillusioned by the failed promise of material progress, disturbed by the cynical politics of the Vietnam War era, and disappointed by religious traditions that seemed unable to satisfy their desire for spiritual fulfillment, they turned away from the traditions in which they had been raised and began to look elsewhere. There were many different reasons why these Westerners made this, quote, journey to the East, unquote, to borrow the title of a work by the German-Swiss Nobel laureate Hermann Hesse. His books, one of which, Siddhartha, told the story of a spiritual seeker's encounter with Shakyamuni Buddha, were very popular with hippies, flower children, and other members of the counterculture, who related to the quest for enlightenment theme so pronounced in Hesse's books. Other popular books that contribute to this spiritual migration included the fantasy adventures written by the Englishman Cyril Henry Hoskin, who claimed to be inhabited by a Tibetan Lama, Lobsang Rampa, and these were bestsellers. Although dismissed as nothing more than imaginative works of fiction, they are rightly credited with creating great interest in the Buddhism of Tibet, and many of those who traveled to India reported they did so largely because they had been intrigued and inspired by Lobsang Rampa's tales. In addition, the immensely popular books by Carlos Castaneda, beginning in 1968 with the teachings of Don Juan, describing his alleged training in shamanism, greatly increased interest in alternative spirituality. Another bestseller that appeared in the early 70s was Be Here Now, by the Western-born spiritual teacher Ram Dass. While he was still known as Richard Alpert and a professor at Harvard, he and his colleague Timothy Leary did extensive research on such psychedelic drugs as LSD. Leary's famous motto, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," summed up the philosophy and lifestyle of many members of the counterculture. And it is not too much of an exaggeration to say that Be Here Now became their Bible. When George Harrison, who later used Be Here Now as the title of one of his songs, and the rest of the Beatles hung out for a while in 1968 with the founder of Transcendental Meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, this also contributed to young Westerners' interest in India. When the lamas of the esoteric traditions of Vajrayana Buddhism began to flee Tibet following the Chinese takeover in 1959, among the first Westerners they encountered in India and Nepal were those who traveled to these countries in search of higher states of consciousness, or at least the altered states of consciousness produced by hallucinogens widely available there. But while many young Tibetans, Nepalis, and Indians were more interested in acquiring the attractive goods and comforts produced by the advanced material civilization of the West than they were in pursuing their own spiritual traditions, it was exactly the opposite for these counterculture refugees from Western materialism. They naturally gravitated towards the spiritual riches the lamas had to offer. The following biography of Lama Thupten Yeshe provides telling examples of the far-reaching effects this historic encounter between East and West has continued to produce.